that stuff. You have your hands and your feet. But anyway, their feet were not locked away in their shoes. And so what they had walked through, they bore evidence of. And as they walked into the front hallway of the house would have a large stone jar, and there would be that which was there, and a servant in any advanced home, and the servant would immediately greet the guests and wash their feet, so that they might in turn go in and enjoy the hospitality of the home. If there was not a servant in the home, then one of the individuals would either engage in that ministry for those who were his travelers along with him, or the individuals would themselves conduct the act of foot washing. Now it would seem at least a possibility that the disciples had worked themselves up into such a state of competitive pride that there was absolute stalemate. That they must have looked at one another, looked at the stone jar, and then looked at the floor. They couldn't look at the floor without looking at their feet, and when they looked at their feet, the problem started all over again. But they scurried in, and they were seated at the table. The meal, we're told, was already being served, verse 2, and no one had taken the initiative. Now, the cultural dimension needs to be grasped as we come to apply these verses in conclusion. So that's the first thing. We need to understand the custom of the day. Secondly, we need to understand and grasp the symbolism which Peter missed. The fact that it took place as the meal was being served illustrates the deliberate nature of Christ's action. It's something that we often miss when we study this passage. Jesus did not stand at the door and take the place of the servant at the door and wash feet as they came in. But that had not happened as would normally happen. But rather it was as the meal was being served that he gets up and in a deliberate action reveals this parable which I've alluded to. And the same Jesus who had spoken about spiritual birth in John chapter 3, about spiritual water in John chapter 4, spiritual bread in John chapter 6, is here addressing the issue of spiritual cleansing. Now, when it comes to Simon Peter in verse 6, we can understand the incongruity which confronts Peter in his mind. And the way the text is put together in the original, it reads like this: Lord, do you my feet wash? Lord, dost thou my feet wash? And the two words are said in juxtaposition to one another, revealing the incongruity. Peter says something's wrong here. If anybody should be washing feet, Lord, it shouldn't be you. You are not the one who washes feet. And the conversation which then follows is a classic illustration of the mistakes which emerge from conceiving in physical terms of that which is clearly spiritual in its significance. And we dealt with that in John chapter 6, remember? When Jesus said, you can eat my body and drink my blood. The hermeneutical principle, the principle of interpretation, was the same there. If you conceive of that in physical terms, then your conclusions will be wrong. It needs to be understood within the spiritual context in which the teaching was given. And so the same is true here. Peter immediately grabs hold of this in terms of the physical implications, while Jesus is using it to reveal the spiritual implications. And so he tells him, verse 7, you don't realize what I'm doing, but later you will understand. Cross-reference that with John chapter 16, verse 12 through 14, where Jesus talks about the giving of the Spirit, who will lead them into all truth. And it would seem that Jesus in verse 7 is alluding to that creation of insight which will be theirs when the Spirit comes. Now, Peter is aware of the incongruity of the present situation, but he's dreadfully unaware of another incongruity, and that is the incongruity of a disciple telling his Lord what he may or may not do. You notice this Lord and then no. The two words do not go hand in hand. You don't say Lord, no. You say Lord, yes. And Peter says this is incongruous, but he fails to see the incongruity in his own life. And Jesus says, hey, Peter, let's get this straight. Unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Now what is Jesus saying? Unless I wash your feet, you're not one of mine? Yes. But is that all that he's saying? Clearly no, as the context unfolds. In other words, Jesus is doing what he was vastly able to do, and that is taking something which is physical and real and immediate and embodying it with that which is future and spiritual and vital. Peter, if I might summarize it, this is what Jesus is saying. Peter, unless by means of my entire work of humiliation, of which this feet washing is only a part, unless by this I cleanse you from your sins, I really wash you, you will not share in the fruits of my redemptive purpose. So in other words, Jesus, just in the same way as when the water ran out, the wine ran out and the water was changed into wine, Jesus was immediately looking forward to the water of life and to his blood being shed. So here, when he speaks about washing, there is clearly that which is far more significance than a first reading would reveal. Now, Simon Peter, when he gets a hold of this, doesn't really grasp it yet, but typical Simon Peter, he goes absolutely overboard. 1 minute he's saying, Lord, I don't think you've got it right. You're not going to wash my feet. And then in verse 9 he says, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Typical Simon Peter. Who would like to walk on the water? Please, sir, I'll walk on the water. Okay, let's go. 1 minute he looks at Jesus, next minute he's shouting, help, get me out of this. Who knows who I am? Please, sir, I know who you are. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Very good. And then Jesus goes on to say, and I'm going to go and I'm going to die. And Peter says, not a chance. And Jesus says, hey, wait a minute, get behind me, Satan. In the same way, Peter says, though everybody leave you, I will never desert you. I would be prepared to die for you. And the servant maid says, did you know this man? He says, no, I never saw him in my life before. And here he is, classic. You're not going to wash my feet. If I don't wash your feet, Peter, you don't have a part with me. Oh, well, in that case, wash my hands and wash my head as well. But what he's actually doing is he's giving the response of the woman at the well in John chapter 4. Remember, Jesus said, if you knew who it was who offered you a drink of water, and if you knew the significance of what I was saying, you would ask him to give you a drink and you would never thirst again. The woman said, that sounds like a brilliant idea. She says, give me this water. Why? So that I may never come back to the well and have to draw again. She missed the point. Jesus was not speaking about trips to the well. He was speaking about the water of life. Jesus is not here speaking about the fact that if you have so much of your skin washed and physically cleansed, an action done by one to another that is external, somehow that will usher you into the kingdom. No. He's saying, get the point, Peter. My humiliation, that which I portray before you, is a visible evidence of the great laying aside of my glory when I will be hanged upon that cruel cross. And even then, Peter is reluctant to let Jesus do what he wants. Jesus is just washing feet at the moment. And Peter, first of all, says, you're not going to wash my feet. And then he doesn't say, okay, wash my feet. He says, wash my hands and wash my head. The Lord must have felt like saying to him, why don't you cut it out, Peter? Why don't I just wash what I want to wash, and why don't you just sit there and be quiet for a while? Just for once in your life. I mean, can't we just get through the thing, Peter? And so get the point. In this foot washing, he is symbolizing the cleansing power of his shed blood. And Jesus uses the imagery of a man who bathes, which can only be understood, I put it to you, in these terms. Verse 10, a person who had a bath before he went out for the evening doesn't need to have another bath when he reaches the house, because he's had a good wash, but his feet are dirty because of the open sandals. And what he's saying is this: when a man or a woman enters into the cleansing power of my blood, when they believe and trust in me, that in the shedding of my blood there is forgiveness for sins, then they do not need to go through some process again and again. when they have been justified freely by my grace, by